Today, my guest is Ed Buckner. Ed, welcome to the show.
Yep, good to be here.
Thank you. Thanks so much for joining me. And Ed Buckner is not to be confused with the Little Rock, Arkansas weatherman. Dr. Ed Buckner has a BA from Rice University, a Master of Education, and a PhD in Educational Leadership from Georgia State. And Dr. Buckner and his son, Michael Buckner, wrote a book called In Freedom We Trust, An Atheist Guide to Religious Liberty in 2012. You were an American Atheist activist who served, oh, there we go, In Freedom We Trust. Thank you for bringing that. That's awesome. And you were the president of American Atheists from 2008 to 2010, succeeded by David Silverman. And you served as executive director for the Council for Secular Humanism from 2001 to 2003. And you've also been working with the Atlanta Freethought Society as well. And you also led a protest at a 2007 rally organized by the Georgia governor at that time, Sonny Perdue, who was asking people to pray for rain, which is crazy.
That was my first opportunity to be world famous. It was, I was actually quoted from that protest in Singapore and weird places like that. So
that's awesome. And is it correct you're a board member for American Atheists still?
No, I have been, but I'm not now. No.
Okay, very good. And could you tell us, obviously that's a brief, very quick bio, but could you tell us just a little bit more about your overall background?
Well, I'm old and decrepit. What else do you want to know?
You don't look a day over 30 to me.
I've had a long and checkered career. I've been on a university faculty. I've been an administrator at a technical school. They call it a technical college now. I've taught at university level at a technical school. I've had a lot of different jobs. I've only been fired once. I was fired as a busboy when I was a teenager, supposedly because I was too slow, but actually because the guy that was in charge of it had a buddy who needed a job. Out I went. And
is it correct your father was a clergyman?
Yes, he was an Episcopal minister was the term they always used. And he was quite religious. My mother was probably more pious than my father, if that makes any sense. But they were certainly both quite religious. And I grew up in a Christian household, and as a nominal believer, I wouldn't claim I was a very good Christian. I really hadn't studied the ins and outs of it very well, but I had all the outward and visible signs. I was president of the church youth group. I sang in the choir, which is amazing because I can't carry a tune in a bucket. But I had all sorts of official roles. I was an acolyte, all that kind of stuff. But I don't know whether I am remembering correctly, but as I look back on it, I don't think that I was profoundly religious then.
Okay.
I don't think I took it as seriously as some people appear to take it. Now, that's partly a function of being an Episcopalian, which is, Catholic light, everybody knows, but partly personal function, I think. Now, I was teacher's kid, preacher's kid. I was harassed, or occasionally teased anyway, about being the preacher's kid, and I was expected to be goody two shoes and very moral, but I didn't get into a lot of trouble. I didn't cause my parents much in the way of embarrassment or shame or any of that sort of thing. So,
with the Episcopalian Church, I don't know tons about it, but are they clear on the gospel compared to some other groups? Like, in other words, are they focused on your depravity and your need for Jesus as your substitute?
Yeah, the Episcopal Church, it goes back to the Church of England. Henry VIII started it, and my mother was always embarrassed and assured me that it was not started just because Henry VIII wanted a divorce, but in fact that is why it was started. The Episcopal Church, it's old and set in its ways, and it's associated socially, in the U.S. at least, with upper middle class folks, or people who strive to be upper class, middle class, and pretentious is what the Baptists would say about them. But there are all sorts of jokes. Wherever you find four Episcopalians, you always find a fifth. because in Baptist southern parts, Episcopalians were famous for being willing and able to drink, which was somehow a big deal.
Yeah, to Baptists.
But anyway, the Episcopalians are more mainstream. There are branches of it. My sister is what do they call it? Not fundamentalist Episcopalian, but
conservative, or
huh?
Like a conservative, or
Conservative, but something more. Anyway, most Episcopalians seem to be more concerned about and interested in being a member of a good and respectable faith than they are in details. Now, my father would preach sermons on Sunday that in fact had a Bible text, at least some of the time. And the Episcopal Church does accept the Bible as authoritative. I think technically Catholics do too, but the Episcopal Church is hierarchical, but not as hierarchical as the Roman Catholics. For example, there is no pope. There is an Archbishop of Canterbury who's nominally the head, but he doesn't have anything like the power to speak for all Catholics that the Pope does.
right.
But we do have, the Episcopalians do have bishops and that sort of thing. There is a, I don't know, presiding bishop, I think she is called, I believe it's a woman now, of the Episcopal Church of the U.S. So nominally and technically the Bible is the basis, but in practice it's not taken nearly as seriously or as importantly as fundamentalist Baptists would take it.
Do you, with your, you're saying your mother was a little bit more pious about her faith versus your father. Do you think your father actually believed that Jesus really was the Son of God and the Savior?
Oh, I think so. I don't think he thought carefully and deeply about it, but that may be improperly insulting to him. I don't know. He just didn't focus primarily on theological matters. He was much more interested in being, he didn't use the word, but in being a pastor, in calling on the sick and going to people,
Shepherding,
doing some informal counseling, and maybe close to formal at least some of the time. He was known, rightly, I think, as a kind and gentle man. And, I certainly love my father. I've been accused by people who don't know anything about me of becoming an atheist just because I was rebelling against my parents. Just not true. I loved my father till he died. As far as I know, he loved me. So, I
was going to ask you about that question later, so we'll go into it now. I hear some of that sometimes myself. I've heard other people say that. How do you help Christians who, most of them don't want to listen. They're not going to even ask you questions. But when they do listen and say, hey, I'm just curious, what happened? What's your story? How do you help them to understand that this was not somebody hurt me, so I'm just walking away from a bad pastor or a bad parent or, something like that, that this is actually about the content of the faith? Like, this is a crazy mythological religion.
Sure.
Versus personal.
It's hard to have those conversations because not all, but most people have a hard time with anybody questioning their basic ideas that they're unwilling to question themselves. That goes not just for Christians, but for some atheists I know, and for people who have a political view that's different from somebody else's, etc. We human beings have a hard time questioning what we think. It's perfectly normal. And it's hard to get past that with people. In this country and in this part of this country, in the South, not Montana, but down here in Georgia, it was, when I was your age and younger, very much the default that Christianity was moral, correct, true, and that questioning it was an insult to God and an insult to your parents and to everybody who was decent and moral. That is still true to some extent, but it's far less true than it was. Things have changed gradually, and there is more of a tendency now in the South to accept somebody's lack of religion as okay. I mean, I'm not saying they're happy about it. Some of them may be, but most are not. But we have neighbors and friends who are religious and who are fine with the fact that I'm not religious, and they know that I'm not. I don't mean I've had any theological discussions with most of them, because I haven't. Don't want to hurt their feelings, and they don't want to hurt mine. Unfortunately, it does get very personal. It's a long anecdote and probably not worth recounting, but long after I had made my lack of religion public, my loss of faith, which I never did consider a loss, I didn't discuss these things with my parents early on. I didn't want to hurt their feelings, and I didn't think there was any chance I'm going to change their minds. So I didn't live in the same state, and I didn't actively hide it, but I also didn't make an issue of it. But some years after I had become an atheist, and before I got into the most activist phase, but where I'm still some activist, I had told my parents that I was not religious, that I was an atheist. And my mother said, "Would you just read one book?" And I said, "Sure, Mother, whatever you say." And I read, it was Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. She was sure that was going to convince me beyond any doubt. And I asked her to read just an essay, and I sent her a copy of it. Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian. Just not the whole book, but just the essay, Why I'm Not a Christian. And then I got to her house a month or two later. I had read Mere Christianity. I was prepared to discuss it intellectually and impersonally. I found a key part of that book where he says, the best evidence, or I'm paraphrasing, but basically he says the best evidence that Christianity, or at least that theism is true, is that we all have a conscience. We know right and wrong, and that's instilled in us by God. And it's pretty easy to pick that apart. We all have a conscience because we grew up and were socialized, and we have learned completely different things about what is right and what is wrong. The Aztecs thought it was perfectly correct to cut open a virgin's chest and take out his or her heart for the sun gods, and they thought that was moral. Christians thought slavery was moral. So we learn right and wrong, but we don't have a conscience that tells us what's right and wrong, that is consistent or true or whatever. So anyway, I was going to have this conscious, careful discussion with her. And I sat down on the couch and we started to talk. And she said, "Before we start, I just want to tell you one thing." She told me an anecdote about how in the Soviet Union, this was before Russia was Russia, and while it was still the Soviet Union, where the soldiers had come into an Russian Orthodox church to arrest the pastor or the preacher or whatever, priest. And he turned to the congregation and said, "Just one thing before I go, he is risen." And my mother thought that was terribly powerful, emotional, and dispositive as far as the argument went. I didn't think any such thing, but I didn't laugh at her. I didn't ridicule her. But before she could even finish telling the anecdote, she got up and left the room in tears. This was clearly a matter of emotion for her, not of rational thinking, not of careful consideration. And I realized I didn't try to pursue the conversation. There was no point. She did not want to have what I wanted to have. I wanted to have a rational discussion with a careful weighing of ideas and evidence and all the rest. And she wanted to hold forth and to persuade me without using evidence or argument. And it just wasn't going to happen. And it didn't happen. I'm not saying I didn't love my mother. I did. She had her fault. Yeah, we all do. But it was a piece of evidence that's typical, I think, of dealing with anybody who's got an emotional rather than a rational attachment to any idea. If you want to sit down and talk to a Trump supporter or even a Biden supporter who is emotionally committed to his or her point of view, simple statement of, "Well, look at this bit of evidence, look at this, look at this, look at this," isn't going to change your mind. It's not going to work. There's actually some evidence, apparently, where if you offer contrary evidence, it reinforces the mind of a person who's not capable of or willing to discuss what they're doing. So,
Yeah, especially when they get into
there is no good answer. I've been in lots and lots of debates. I like debates, but I have long ago given up the notion that a well-crafted debate will change everybody's mind. It may change some. The best thing a debate can do, and the best thing you can do in an individual conversation probably, is to get somebody to start thinking. That's the best you can hope for. Persuade, and by all means, I always, at every debate I've ever been in, as far as I can remember, I've always said, read widely. Read things you agree with, but read things you disagree with too. And that goes for the atheist in the audience and the Christians too.
Yeah, I think with your comment about, basically people, when they see evidence and it makes them actually stand firmer in their wrong beliefs, and the lack of evidence kind of digging their heels in, it seems like that gets even exponentially harder to deal with when they're convinced that there's some kind of conspiracy. A conspiracy to, COVID's a great example. It's all a conspiracy, and I have family members that are deep in this conspiracy. I mean, they are almost violent about this thing isn't real, and it's crazy. I mean, it's honestly crazy, because you think you literally could show them evidence, and all they can say is that's proof of the conspiracy. And at that point, it is like you can't go further.
That's the way conspiracy theories work. Any evidence against it is just evidence that it's a bigger conspiracy than we thought. Oh my God.
Well, what's amazing too to me is, and I want to get back to your story in a second, but since we're on this, when you think about, for example, the COVID thing, or any subject really, where people are like, this is such a big conspiracy. They're out to make this big story up. And you think, okay, so you being not you, but just people being a non-scientists, not PhDs, they can just read a few things on the internet and conclude, I want to be skeptical, and even hyper skeptical, and almost violently skeptical against COVID. And I'm thinking, why don't you take just a little piece of that skepticism and apply it to your religion too? And it's really crazy when you think about how hyper skeptical they really are at some subjects, but in others. And it makes me think a lot that it's almost like a childhood thing, where it's like my mom and my daddy, my aunt, my uncle, they all taught me Jesus loves me, this I know. And it's like they're not intellectually arguing. It's almost like they're saying, stop telling me that my mom and daddy didn't tell me the truth. And even when they're 40, 50 years old, it's like that same psychological childhood issue, like it just stunted them and they can't get past it.
Well, they have been taught, sometimes consciously, but mostly unconsciously, to believe that if you question God, question the existence of God, question the truth of Christianity or Islam or whatever else you believe, you are grievously insulting the people who taught you that.
Yeah.
That's not logical. That's not rational. I can love somebody who taught me something quite incorrect. I mean, if somebody intentionally misled me and lied to me about something, maybe then it's insulting to disagree with them. But if they in good conscience tried to teach me something that they believed was true, but which in the fullness of all the evidence and the whole experience I think is not true, disagreeing with them shouldn't be insulting to them, but it is. And it works kind of it works quite well and kind of unconsciously. I remember vaguely, I'm in my 75th year, so my memory sucks sometimes. But I have this vague memory of standing in church, St. Christopher's Episcopal Church in League City, Texas, where my father was the minister, and standing up while they were singing songs or some part of the ceremony, and thinking to myself, I don't think all this stuff really makes much sense. But then looking around and thinking about it, and the people that I loved and that I cared about and that I respected all believed this stuff. And I remember thinking, well, it must be true. Surely they wouldn't all believe it if it wasn't. And it wasn't, I don't mean I had a careful, abstract, rational to and fro with myself about it. I'm just a fleeting doubt that was put aside fleetingly because of all the people I knew and loved. And I was naive enough to think at that point, the whole world, not just everybody in that church, but everybody who mattered, who cared about anything, was a believer, and it would just be absurd for me to be a non-believer.
Mm-hmm.
Then terrible things like education happened. I have said before, I'll say it again, parents, if you want your children to hold on to their very straightforward, basic faith, don't educate them. Don't send them to college. It's a terrible thing. You might make them think. And that, again, goes for for if you have, and I've known a few, fundamentalist atheists, if you have a belief that you want your child to have without questioning it, don't let them get educated. I lost, to the extent that it's a loss, my faith over a long stretch. It didn't happen all of a sudden. It didn't happen overnight. It wasn't a reverse road to Damascus. I didn't stop seeing the light. It was a long and steady thing. A lot of BS in the dorms, midnight bull sessions, discussions with people I came to love and care about who didn't agree with me. Some of them different religions, Jewish or I don't know if I knew any Muslims then or not. I don't think I did. But anyway, and my future wife, the woman I've been married to for over 50 years, who was not a believer.
Congratulations.
And coursework. The single specific piece of, there were lots of things. One of them was reading Bertrand Russell. But the one specific thing I remember was an essay that didn't, in fact, question the existence of God. I took a course. I went to Rice University, and at Rice, I was an English major, there were three categories, A, B, and C. A was history, English, and stuff like that. I think foreign languages, I don't remember. B was political science and sociology and anthropology and what have you. And C were the hard sciences and mathematics. And even those of you who majored in an A thing had to take a certain number of B and C electives, some specific required courses, but more just take other stuff. And I took an anthropology of religion class. Now, to tell you, I don't remember it all, but probably I took the course because it was offered at a time of day that I could tolerate or something like that. I mean, it probably had nothing to do with strong intellectual curiosity. But I took this course in comparative religion. I've still got the textbook. It changed my life. This textbook. Reader in Comparative Religion, an anthropological approach. Lessa was the editor, Lessa. And it had very profound effect on me. Not so much right in the minute, but it reverberated for years afterwards. One essay, an essay that didn't specifically talk about believing in God, and it was a not very serious essay. It was by Horace Minor. He wrote it, I think, in the 40s. It was published in 1956, but this was in the 1960s that I read this reader that had all kinds of different essays. Body Ritual Among the Nasarima. Well, in my college days, I was very fond of parodies. A couple of my essays that got the best grades in English class and stuff were parodies. So I was fond of parodies. This was a parody. The Nasarima is just American backwards.
Okay.
And he was parodying anthropological approaches. He talked about the Nasarima's weird rituals regarding private functions in the sacred temple that was in the middle of the house and walled in stone and had a little font. And, it in retrospect, I'm not sure it's all that effective as a parody, but here's what was good about that essay and what really bounced around in my head for years. It made me recognize that when you look at someone else's views, especially their religion, and you see something silly, ridiculous, how could anybody believe that crap? You need to be able to shift around and get into their head and look at your religion your
Mm.
anything, but especially religion, and see how ridiculous it looks. Because this guy made a point of looking at Americans from a pretended to be from a perspective that was not American.
Mm.
And that is the lesson that I would try to convey to anyone, especially Christians, but anyone who's holding on to a view and hasn't seriously analyzed and compared and made sense out of that. Look at it with fresh eyes. It's very hard to do. None of us do this easily, but look at it with fresh eyes. Learn some things about it that are not things that people who agree with you think, but people who disagree with you think. You don't have to accept it. Just learn what they think. Take a look at it from their point of view, and see if it makes the same kind of sense in the long run. And don't commit to changing your mind, and don't commit to not changing your mind. Commit to leaving it open. Really, really hard for lots of people to be tentative and skeptical and open-minded about their views. And like I said, that's true of some atheists too. It's not a particular characteristic of Christians.
Yeah, you definitely see that. You see that thing, like you're saying, with the atheists, you see it even like in the mythicist versus historicist camp of, was there an actual Jesus at the core? And it's like, you have to be open to seeing different sides of it. And I've got several people who are really pushing my boundaries on that in terms of stretching my mind. Really good atheists that are saying there's more to this than you've already researched, and it's great. I love it.
Well, there's some pretty serious atheists who I respect on both sides of the question of whether Jesus Christ was a living historical figure, a single person who lived in the Middle East in the time period. And Frank Zindler, a guy I respect, is convinced not only that he did not live there were various people who were identified with parts of the myth, but that there was no particular Jesus Christ. And he takes it almost as an article of lack of faith. I'm literally agnostic on the question. I don't know whether a single person named Jesus lived in the period when he was supposed to. Other people that I respect think he did, but they're still atheists. So it's not an article of faith for me, but it's an interesting question. And of course, lots and lots has been written about it, but ultimately doesn't settle the question of the truth of Christianity or theism based on whether a particular guy existed at a particular time, in my opinion.
Yeah, the good thing is, like, mythicists often say, at the end of the day, if they're wrong, and they're not, most of them that I know of aren't saying like, we know for sure that this is the way it worked, because there's not enough evidence. Especially someone like Dr. Robert Price would just say, look, the best evidence we have is this, but if more evidence comes up, we'll refigure it. But the nice thing is, it really doesn't matter. I mean, at best, he was some kind of failed apocalyptic prophet or magician, and it's like, it doesn't really matter. We're obviously not talking about real deity here. But also,
so guilt by, I know Bob Price. I don't know him real well, but I knew him and worked with him for a while back when I was with the Council for Secular Humanism. And I understand that some of my fellow atheists are just robustly condemning him and want to have him deplatformed and all this thing because I think he's a Trump supporter. Well, I don't agree with him about being a Trump supporter, but that doesn't have anything to do with whether he's accurate about these other things. And I do believe in free speech and freedom of conscience, and that goes for people who disagree with me, even on something really important like Trump.
Yeah, exactly.
Or anything else.
One thing you said, a few minutes ago that really made me think of someone else I spoke to recently was this idea of an outsider test for faith. I was just interviewing John Loftus a few days ago, and he wrote this book about the idea of, anything that you would look at a different religion and say, I don't know, I'm kind of skeptical. That doesn't sound right. If you're talking about somebody riding on a white horse up to heaven, you're talking about someone finding gold plates in the ground, whatever it is, if your immediate response is, something about that just sounds so weird and made up. And yet we don't apply that same kind of mentality to our own religion. And it's surprising how hard, a lot of what I'm doing is preparing for helping people who are kind of on the fence, but just don't have all the information. I'm putting together a presentation that I hope to do eventually that's going to be very long, very thorough. It just takes all this stuff about, where did we get the canon from? Where did Yahweh and Elohim come from? All the Jesus mythology, the parallels, put it together so people just have the information, decide what you want to do with it. But here's the information that they never taught you in Sunday school. But it's amazing. I'm learning that there's like a whole other side to this, of the psychology, even of getting your foot in the door, to have people just say, okay, I'll listen. Like, just that alone is so hard. And
it's not hard to have people say that, but
right.
to me, it's pretty hard.
Yeah, well, some people I'm seeing, really, they won't even give it 2 minutes. But yeah, some people, they'll be like, yeah, I'll listen, but only with the goal of debunking you and getting back to my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And it's so frustrating. But
well, it helps with some people some of the time to know that many of the issues and things that you find in the Bible existed in other mythologies and other religions before. It helps to find out that, I don't know, that a council of human beings decided which books were okay and which books were not. And it was a close vote in some cases, it is strange to me that somebody who is a Southerner, as I am, will say to me, oh, slavery was immoral, it was wrong, it should never have existed. And then when you say, yeah, that's true, and I agree with you, but the preachers, not just the believers, the preachers in the South, the U.S. South, in the 1840s and 50s and 30s, found without any problem passages in the Bible that supported the idea that slavery was a gift from God. It had to be paired with racism to really work. James Henry Hammond was a superb artiste of this terrible vernacular. And they say, oh, well, those people were wrong. They didn't interpret the Bible and what God wanted correctly. How do you know? How do you know they were wrong instead of you?
Yeah.
There's morality and moral idea. I mean, I don't want to suggest that I think the question of immorality for slavery is just an arbitrary matter. I don't think it is. I can make very good case for the fact that slavery is immoral based on nothing to do with religion. So I'm not saying it's arbitrary and capricious whether it's immoral or not, but I am saying that having a sacred text or a God involved in the conversation neither adds nor detracts. It does not resolve the problem or the question of the morality of it in the least.
Yeah, I'm learning this even this week about the Martin Luther's impact on Nazi Germany. I don't know if you've dove much into that, but he wanted their houses burned down, and he wanted them killed and burned. And
he was a virulent anti-Semitic. He really was.
And he was considered, I think they took a vote even like 10 or 20 years ago, what was the most famous German ever, and I think he was number 2 still. Yeah. And it's like, it's amazing to me how Christians can levy the thought of, you have no moral grounding because you don't have our God. And I'm thinking, like, I have no moral grounding, but I can say, don't own people, don't stone them. There's, don't do genital mutilation. Don't kill your daughter just because she had sex out of marriage. Just like, it's crazy. Wait.
You're against that?
It's amazing. And yet they're like, oh, we're so much more moral than you. And we could get down that path. I know that, but I do want to get back to your story. Could you tell me more about what happened with your conversations with your mother and anyone else in your close circles, that as they realized what you were thinking?
Well, I remember for some reason a conversation with a friend named Bonnie Huckabee. I think I read later that she was gay. I certainly didn't know that at the time. She was a year ahead of me in high school and went to Rice University before I did. Unfortunately, she committed suicide some years later, so I lost track of where she went and how. But I remember standing in front of St. Christopher's Episcopal Church, and Bonnie, who I think, I'm not sure, but I think she was an Ayn Rand supporter, almost extreme libertarian objectivist. I don't accept that. But anyway, she's, Edward, you don't really believe all that crap, do you? I thought, wow, somebody said that out loud. This was, I think, after I had had my experience of standing in church and saying, everybody I know thinks this is true. It must be true. And here was somebody I knew and respected, at least modestly, who didn't think so and who ridiculed me. And I'm pretty sure my answer to her was, well, of course I believe that. Everybody does, or something like that. And I don't remember having any further conversation with her about it, but it struck a spark of doubt that helped, that and the anthropology course and the bull sessions helped me to gradually lose this notion that Christianity must be true. I remember one experience from a few years later. My son is now 50, and this was when he was 4, 5, something like that. One of my sisters, I have 3, one of my sisters sent him some Bible, a book of Bible story, children's book of Bible, nothing heavy-handed, or at least she didn't think it was heavy-handed. And I said to her, sis, I'm not sure that's a good idea. And she said, oh, I know you don't believe these things. I just want to make sure that he has an opportunity to see things that you might not be making available to him. And I thought, this is just ridiculous. I mean, the whole culture is just infused with all this stuff about Christianity. Even if I were trying to keep my son from learning about it, and I certainly wasn't. My wife and I were both atheists, but Michael, from the moment he was able to speak or listen or read or hear anything, knew that he could read what he wanted to, could think what he wanted to. I said, I don't know if I would have done it, but I think I said that if he wanted to go to Sunday school, I'd take him to Sunday school. I might go with him to keep him from being abused. But anyway, whether I did that or not, I was certainly, he read Asimov's Guide to the Bible, both volumes, and practically memorized them. He knew more about the Bible by the time he was a teenager than most adults ever knew about the Bible.
I don't think I've heard that book. I'll have to look that one up. That sounds interesting.
Oh, it's famous. It's not an attack on the Bible. It's just a dispassionate. This is Isaac Asimov, of course, who published over 500 books. So, he's got plenty of books. But Asimov's Guide to the Bible, and I think the 2 volumes are Old Testament and New. I don't know. But anyway, his analysis of it is historical. He recounts not only when bits were written and what preceded them and what the influences were and that kind of thing. He doesn't get into a theological dispute about whether the Bible's true or not. He was an atheist, so he certainly didn't think it was, but he does. It's not a book promoting atheism or books promoting atheism. Anyway, I remember one of the things that I remember about this experience with my sister is she kind of persisted and said, I just want to make stuff available to him. So I was not then, I don't think I was then a member of American Atheist, but I wrote to Madalyn Murray O'Hair, and the American Atheists headquarters then were in Austin, Texas, and gave them my sister's address and said, would you please send some atheist literature to my sister so that her kids could be exposed to. She never sent anything else to my son along those lines. I think she got the message.
Yep.
And that I never met Madalyn Murray O'Hair. She was the first president of American Atheists, and I was a later president, but I never met her. So I knew plenty of people who did meet her. And she was a mixed bag in some ways. But anyway, the various experiences, I remember in the car with my brother and parents, I don't know when this was, I think maybe when I was in college, quoting Madalyn Murray O'Hair they were making fun of her, ridiculing the idea. And they said, this is a free country. We have freedom of religion, not freedom from religion. And I thought of that I mean, I heard that lots of times when I was a young person, and I thought, oh, FFRF was wise to name their organization. Ann Gaylor named it the Freedom from Religion Foundation because the myth is this country does not accept, doesn't even allow for freedom from religion. Of course we do and always have. That's not new. And I also remember it's a strange conversation. Madeleine Murray O'Hair was interviewed and by somebody in Texas. I don't remember the details. And one of the things she said in the course of her interview was, "Thank God I'm an atheist." And I had family members or friends say, "See, even Madeleine Murray O'Hair really believes in God. She just pretends she doesn't." She was making a joke, dummy. Anyway,
Ricky Gervais said that I think at least once when he did the Golden Globes too.
Yeah. Well, and she went around the country with this, I forgot his name, preacher, and they had kind of informal debates. They were both promoting themselves,
right,
their personal causes. And he asked her to sign his Bible, and she signed it. "Keep the faith, Bob, but keep it to yourself." Which I always thought was a good story. I don't think I heard that one when I was growing up. My loss of belief and my gaining of atheism and secular humanism and so forth was very much a long, drawn-out affair. Lots of reading, lots of thinking, lots of conversations. And I think that's the only important or useful way to change your mind. I think if you read one sentence somewhere and that persuades you that there is a God, that there isn't a God, that Christianity is true, that Muhammad is the one true prophet, anything like that, then you haven't thought about it very carefully or very well, and you need to be more nuanced in your life, more skeptical, more open to a variety of perspectives, and you need to look at things in the complexity that is reality rather than in the simplicity that is offered by any one particular.
Yeah, to repeat what you said before, to get the other perspective. I mean, I went to Bible college. I've memorized entire books of the Bible, memorized thousands of other verses. Listened to probably thousands of hours of preachers on the radio, and hundreds of theology books and devotional books. Mission school. I mean, I knew my Bible. I knew theology. And when I began to, 18 months ago, when I began to really dive into this, the origins of Christianity, I mean to say, I found out that I didn't know anything that was really critical to this discussion. And that was shocking, not just because of the facts, but the idea of, I find it hard to believe that all these Christian teachers and preachers and theologians didn't know some of this stuff. I mean, it's possible, but that none of them knew any of these pagan parallels, and knew anything about the Greco-Roman mystery cults, knew anything about all kinds of topics, about mimesis, about the way that the New Testament is clearly copying the structure and even literally copying words from Plato and Homer, and from the Iliad, the Odyssey, from the Bacchae, from the Aeneid. It's like no one ever said that, and I'm not necessarily sure that I would have or would not have deconverted. I'd love to imagine if what information would have started the ball rolling versus which ones I would have dug my heels in and said, whatever. But if someone really convincingly proved to me, yeah, this book has entire structures that come from the Iliad and the Odyssey, Luke and Acts, clearly from the Iliad and the Odyssey, clearly from the Aeneid and the Bacchae, I would have said, at least I'd like to know more. And who knows when the ball would have actually started really moving at that point. But I did want to ask you, you sound like you didn't have a shock to your system. Like it never was like, oh my goodness, the floodgates just opened. Is that?
No, I didn't. I just didn't have such a thing. I was in my early college years, to make my father happy and proud, still going around saying, when I grow up, I'm going to be a preacher. And I met my beautiful wife in my junior year at Rice. And she said, "Oh, you're going to be an Episcopal minister? I said, yeah, I think so. She said, well, then I can't marry you because I'm not going to be a preacher's wife. What? No. And I thought about that very long and hard. And I thought, this woman means a heck of a lot more to me than my commit. So I quit saying, I'd pretty well quit doing anything about it anyway before then. But by that point, I quit saying nonsense about what I'm going to be when I grow up. So that might have been sort of close to a shock to my system, but not really. It was a long, slow, gradual, intellectual and probably emotional, but it wasn't primarily an emotional process for me. You were talking about preachers and having information. I have a good friend, somebody I have a lot of respect and affection for, who is a minister, a preacher at a mainstream Protestant church in the Atlanta area, who is an atheist. And he says, look, I'm not open about it. I'm not out of the closet. I kind of wish I was. I feel a little bit guilty. But I went to, and I forget, was it Yale or Princeton or one of the major theological seminaries. And he said, I went through all kinds of training, and I discovered after I'd been there a while that probably a majority of my professors were not believers. They were certainly not Orthodox believers, and most of them don't even seem to have been believers. Now, this friend of mine, and I disagree with him about this, and he knows it, thinks that on the whole, religion can do a great deal of good. And he counsels his parishioners, congregants. I know what denomination he is, but I don't even want to say that because I don't want to accidentally reveal him. He thinks that the advice he gives to them about being moral and having a good conscience and being kind, that this is helpful and positive, and it probably is. I think religion does some good. I just think it's outweighed by the bad it does. He thinks the good outweighs the bad, especially if practiced by a thoughtful, intelligent, kind, compassionate person like him. Yeah.
I'm just curious, is that for what he preaches and what his church stands for? Is it basically still kind of preaching a real Jesus and a real heaven, hell, like traditional?
I don't know with any kind of detail. I don't know whether he, if he got up in this, behind the pulpit on a Sunday morning and said he is risen like that Russian Orthodox priest, he would be engaging in dishonest lies.
Yeah.
Does he do that? I don't think so, but I don't know exactly how he gets around it. I don't know. I think he focuses in his sermons and in his Sunday school classes, assuming he does that, on treating each other well and the golden rule and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, more of
the
a
golden rule, by the way, is not made up by Christians, despite the fact that a lot of them think it is.
Yeah.
Every culture that we know anything about has some version of almost every culture has some version of the golden rule, and it's easy to see how that could arise in human cultures. You're going to have peace and stability if everybody's not trying to beat the hell out of or kill or get advantage over everybody else. And it's not too hard to go from that to treat others the way you want to be treated.
What you said makes me think a little bit about the mystery cult concept, where there seemed to be people that, in those mystery cults where there was like initiates, where they kind of got some of the real information, the real secrets, whether it's related to visions or angels or what have you. But then there was like a secondary, like a front story. And it almost seems like there was this concept of like, look, the average people aren't going to understand these mysteries. So tell them a story and make them think it's real, but they'll still get the immoral implication of it. Do good, don't hurt people, turn the other cheek, blah, blah, blah. And I understand what they're saying. I mean, I'm not confused about their message, but I do think that for most people, at least speaking for myself, I would rather have the full information and decide for myself, as opposed to someone tricking me and then saying, we find out later, by the way, none of this was true, because that's shocking. And I wanted to read, if it's okay, just a very quick quote that this whole idea of indoctrination and
Hey, it's your show. You can say stuff if you want. Nothing I
sure.
can do to stop you.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'll keep this short because I want to get back to your I want to get back to a little bit about the American Atheists, your work there with them, but just really quickly, if I can find this quote from Marlene Winnell. Have you worked with her at all? Valerie Tarico.
Oh, I know Val. I've never met Valerie Tarico, but I've read a lot of her stuff, and I'm a huge admirer. I actually reached out to her and tried to find out if maybe we could get her to come to Atlanta and give a talk to the Atlanta Freethought Society. She's up in the Northwest, Portland or Seattle or someplace. And she said she really doesn't travel to give talks. But I've read a lot of her stuff, and I am a big admirer of hers.
Yeah. It's amazing. I'm actually going to read at least one here. Terrorism is the use of fear and violence to control. It's not just violence, it's fear of violence. People that brainwash children into fearing for their salvation and feeling guilty and suffering for the rest of their lives with all these trauma are terrorists. In my words, there'd be emotional terrorists or psychological terrorists. Everybody suffers for that. Our whole nation suffers because of that. And it really seems like that's one of the hardest things to show Christians. You are terrorizing your children. In other words, you're saying you're bad. We love you, but you're bad. God loves you, but you're really rotten. And by the way, if you don't believe just like us with our little niche group of belief systems, you're going to burn in hell. And this fear. And then I want to read one more quote.
You can read one more quote, and then I'll tell you about how I testified in court that religious instruction is a form of child abuse. But go ahead.
I want to hear that. Yeah. So this is Marlene Winnell. So she says a couple things. She's talking about guilt that you put on children, which it's just mind-blowing to even say that. But she says you're teaching these kids that this dying, suffering, bloody Christ, you're responsible for. It's because of your sin. And then, so here's this person suffering, Jesus on the cross. Here's this person suffering, and you pray, not P-R-A-Y, but P-R-E-Y, you pray on a child's best instincts, a child's sympathy for somebody's pain, for Jesus's pain. I find that so unbelievably vile. And then that child will feel so terrible that you want this child to be responsible for Jesus's death. And, you're asking these kids, you break these kids down, you get them in tears over what they did to Jesus, about his pain and his death. They visualize it. And then they say, are you sorry for what you did to Jesus? That is emotional abuse, emotional terrorism. And there are people that, like I know Marlene talks about, that you develop your brain as a small child. Some of this stuff you can intellectually think through and say, oh, that's garbage, I'm walking away from it. It still messes with you for sometimes decades.
Yeah. And it particularly messes with a young, not well-formed mind. A mind of a child who thinks their parents are unquestionable. I mean, these are people that they love and that they're totally dependent on. And their parents are saying that you killed Jesus. That's really child abuse. And couple of things about that. I'll wander all over the landscape here unless you control me.
Please, no.
It'll be on your head. I went to Kentucky at the request of the late Edwin F. Kagan, one of my heroes who died way too young. He wasn't all that young, but he died. He asked me to come and testify on behalf of his client. Edwin was an attorney. He was actually the attorney for American Atheists for a while. A client of his was going through a divorce. And the guy that was his client, wanted his son not to go to the Catholic high school. He wanted him to go to public high school, or maybe to an alternate private high school that the guy would pay for. I don't remember. But we went, this is just a hearing before a judge and other expert witnesses and stuff. But I was called as an expert witness. And I testified to the fact that this child, it was a boy, I'm pretty sure, going to the Catholic high school would learn from the high school that his father was, and I quoted from Catholic encyclopedia or whatever, well, I don't remember the source, but I had it with me, a copy of their belief system, that atheism is not just a sin, but one of the worst possible sins, and that atheists are horrible people and all that crap. The judge, who happened to be a Catholic, didn't take too kindly to that, and actually he looked at me and said, "Are you really saying that teaching children Christian stuff is a form of child abuse?" And I said, "Yep." I said, "It's not the same kind of child abuse as beating a child or sexually abusing a child, but it is a form of child abuse. It's terrorism." And anybody know, if you're a Southerner like I am, you know that the Ku Klux Klan's success, and they were quite successful after the Civil War. It was not because they lynched and killed and burned to death every possible opponent of their views, but they did it often enough to scare the crap out of the ones they didn't do it to. And when there was a guy right here in Georgia in the 1870s or 80s, long after the Civil War, I think it was his daughter and his mother and maybe his wife were lynched, hung, killed, because he had the temerity to go and vote. Now, that kind of stuff, which we call terrorism, is obvious terrorism for those of us who are outside of that picture. But for the parent who's teaching his kid that the kid is responsible for Jesus is dying on the cross, that's definitely a form of terrorism too. Now, you can make it more or less abusive by how much you emphasize it, by stressing that, well, all of us human beings are the ones that caused Jesus to die on the cross. It wasn't anything you particularly did, but it is almost impossible not to render it as some form of child abuse. And it's, we lost that case. As I said, the judge was a Catholic himself, and he allowed the mother to decide where the kid was going to go.
That's really sad. I think the whole abusive thing to it, even if someone did kind of give a generic concept of, well, it wasn't you particularly, it was everybody. There's so many other things that get added to it. Like, when you raise a child to believe in genocide, you believe, get a child to believe these stories, it's okay when God says, go in and kill everybody and take the little girls, for yourselves, kill every baby. When God says, with Noah and the flood, I'm killing not just some bad people, but I'm killing every last person, including the babies and the young kids. Everybody's dying. And the land theft, we have the right to come in and steal your land, even though you've been here for thousands of years. We have the right to come in and just take it over because God gave it to us. The idea we're right to stone people. There's so many levels. And I even, case in point, I went to Bob Jones University for my freshman year. And I have repented of that. But I went to Bob Jones, and I remember back then you couldn't interracially date. And it went back, I believe, to this story of, God separated Noah's, sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and that there was reasons that the races separated, and God wanted them separated, and one of them was even cursed, and we know which one they thought was cursed. And it wasn't until I think was that
it was the colored one.
Yeah,
That's
which is
I was told.
Yeah, it still existed even when I was there back in I think it was around the year 2000, and it wasn't until I think one of the George Bushes came to preach to do a presentation politically to the students. And as soon as he left, the news did some research, I guess, and found out that we had these rules against interracial dating. And they blew it up like, oh, this is horrible that, the president would speak at such a school. And they finally changed the rule after, decades and decades. But like as if God's eternal word somehow changes because the political climate changed. But it just, the ways you can say to people, this is abusive, this is mind manipulation, this is psychologically destructive, is endless to me. I mean, we could probably do a couple shows on just this subject, but they can't see it. Well, I'm sorry, say again.
I said I could give you another example.
Yeah, please. Yeah, go. I'd love to hear it.
1880s, somewhere along in there, might have been 90, but probably late 80s, I was asked by a friend who's a retired FBI, his name's Oliver Halley, retired FBI agent. He's a secular humanist, but he had a friend in the, he's retired now, but then he was working for the FBI. And he had a friend who was close to somebody on the Baptist Home Mission Board here in Atlanta. And that person was seeking some atheist point of view on a book of sermons they were going to have published, a book of sermons supporting the right to life. And my friend Oliver read it pretty carefully himself and asked me if I would do so. And I agreed. I don't remember why, probably because I wanted to be a smart ass and change the world. I don't know. But anyway, I read these sermons with great, and they were sermons by some of the best known Christian leaders on the right wing side, right to life side of things. And I marked them up and sent them all kinds of stuff, all of which they ignored. The woman who sent it to me, she was very gracious and friendly and courteous. She replied, thanked me for my help. As far as I could tell, none of the sermons got any kind of change because of that. And I said, one of the sermons that you're proposing to publish shouldn't be published, because if there is such a thing as child abuse, that preacher is guilty of child abuse. And I went on to explain. The preacher told a story, and he preached a sermon about it. And the book did carry this sermon, by the way. This is not, they didn't take my advice, believe it or not. In his sermon, he said that his teenage daughter had been raped and got pregnant from that rape, and that he insisted that she have the baby, which was a blessing from God. And she did too. He's dead now. I've looked him up recently, and he's dead. But you have your stupid beliefs if you want to, but imposing them on a teenage daughter who's gone through the horrific trauma. This was not statutory rape. This was somebody broke into their house and raped his daughter. And he forgave the rapist and visited him in prison. You can do all of that, but don't tell your daughter that she has to bear the baby that was a result of this rape. That's a form of child abuse, and it's definitely religion-based child abuse. Your sound is gone. I don't know why.
Oh, I'm sorry. I know I saw something that was, when I was growing up, that was similar but a little different. The girl had kept the baby, just like in your story, but they made her publicly.
She didn't keep the baby. She put the baby up for adoption.
Okay.
I don't remember for sure.
Well, I remember a girl who had voluntarily, not a girl I personally knew, but just a girl in church, that she had been in a relationship before marriage and, gotten pregnant. And they made her publicly apologize in front of the church. So she now had to stand up in front of 200-300 people and say, this long testimony of, I'm sorry, I did this wrong thing, just shaming her, utter shame. And it blew me away. And when you say the whole right to life thing, versus, pro-life versus pro-choice, it makes me think too that so many of them don't ever seem to want to quote that scripture where it says, if you as a man think that your wife might have been unfaithful, take her to the priest. The priest will take some of the sawdust or whatever, the dust from the ground, put it in water, give it to her, and pronounce a potential curse on her and say, if you are faithful, then this water will do nothing to you. But if you were unfaithful, may this water abort that baby inside of you, and may you become, a curse to your people. And it's like, your own scripture promotes abortion, and
there's nothing in the entirety of both books, both parts of the Bible, Old Testament and New, that specifically condemns abortion as murder. Now, is God pro-life in the broader sense, thou shalt not kill, etc.? Yeah, of course. But there are instances, the one you mentioned is one of them, but also another one where this is Old Testament, but sets forth that if a man shall strike a woman and cause her to lose her child, he'll have to pay a fine. Now, they clearly don't think abortion is, that story doesn't indicate that abortion's okay, but it doesn't indicate that abortion is murder, and it's pretty dang clear about it. And of course, Genesis also says strong implication, I think maybe explicitly, that life begins when you take your first breath. Inspiration is when you first breathe. That's what the word comes from. And, and they asked me they quote verses like, God knew you before you were born. If there is a God, and if this God is omniscient, and he knew you before your great grandfather was born too. So before conception, before any of your relatives thousands of years ago were conceived. So that doesn't tell you, but they don't want to deal with the logic. And I like I said, I took that book on sermons quite seriously. I've written some stuff about it now that's going to be published in Free Inquiry next spring. All of you should look forward to it.
Yeah,
by the way, you mentioned Valerie Tirico earlier. She had an article in Free Inquiry a couple of years ago that was not just pro-choice, but pro-abortion. Why abortion is a good and positive thing. And it's extremely well written and well argued. So
let's look that up. The quick final anecdote before I go to the last question. Just that whole idea of paying money to get out of doing something wrong. I always laugh when I read that one scripture that talks about how if you rape a girl in a certain situation, that all you have to do is pay the father a few shekels, and not only do you not go to jail for it, but you're literally buying her as your wife, and she can't ever leave you. So you're literally paying money to become the rapist husband of this poor girl, and it's
an awful lot wrong with that. Not least the total absence of rights for children or women.
Yeah, and the idea, regardless of
the Ten Commandments, to suggest that women or children should be anything other than property, for example.
Yeah, and slaves is much even worse. It's amazing to me, not just these issues, but the idea that you're telling kids you have to believe this because this is what God said. Apart from each individual subject, which we could dissect, it's like when you push this on kids and say you have to believe this is God, this is wisdom, this is eternal truth, it definitely gets into psychological abuse. I know we're almost out of time. I do want to ask, just could you tell us a little bit about your time with American Atheists, what you did there, and kind of maybe if you remember a favorite memory or something you did or that they did, that you were able to make a difference to the society through it?
Well, what I remember most about it is all these people adoring me and calling me the Pope of Atheism. And it was, I've had several different administrative posts, and that was one of them, that involved some public speaking and debating. And I thoroughly enjoy the public speaking and the debating and writing. Those things really get me going, and I like them. But it did involve some administrative stuff like running staff meetings or trying to get somebody else to do what they said they would do, or and this is sometimes volunteers, sometimes staffers. That's no fun. I don't enjoy that at all. I don't know that I was a sort of an interim president. The acting president, Frank Zindler, did not want to be the regular president, and the previous president, Elaine Johnson, had been fired over some financial stuff. I was told, by the way, at one point, I don't know this, I think it's still true, that I am the only president of American Atheists who left office at my own suggestion, decision, under my own steam. Everybody else, Madeleine Murray O'Hair and her granddaughter and her son, one of her sons, who held the title, although almost practically speaking, she held the power even when they held the title. All of them were murdered. Ellen Johnson was fired. Frank Zimmer was only an acting president. And there was me, and I retired. So I had this great, glorious. It's silly, but I have good memories of it. We had some pretty good conventions. We had, I thought, made some important points. Because I was president of American Atheists, I was invited by an Islamic group in Britain to come to England. They paid my expenses. Took them a while to get around to it, but they paid my expenses. And I debated 4 Muslims in 4 days in England. You can see at least some of this online. And that was interesting and a big highlight for me. The organization has long represented itself, I think, pretty accurately as the Marines, the beachhead, the ones that are the most aggressive and assertive atheists, partly because the people involved are committed to this idea that's correct, but also partly as a way of making it easier for the American Humanist Association or Freedom from Religion Foundation or Atheist Alliance or other groups to be seen as more moderate. Those American atheists are a bunch of extremists. We better deal with American Humanist Association or Council for Secular Humanism. That's oversimplifying it a lot, but there's some truth to that.
Did you get attacked much in terms of, people trying to target you or?
Well, there were plenty of people who disagreed with me very vigorously, and I got emails saying I was, going straight to hell and that kind of stuff, but nothing very personal or I mean, I never felt like anybody tried to shoot me or do anything remotely like that. And, I'm glad they didn't. I think I've suffered some disadvantages from being an atheist over the course of my career or careers, but not serious ones, and none from that either. Now, my successor wore a bulletproof vest for a while, and I think he did, in fact, get some death threats. I don't know.
Is it, would you say that there is an aspect of the group that is a little bit more favoring a more militant perspective of not physically militant, but just, philosophically militant, saying we really need to make inroads in this culture, as opposed to we'll just have our own private discussions, like we want to make a big difference out there?
There's no question that American Atheist has been, pretty much from the days of Madeleine Murray O'Hair, an organization committed to a very assertive atheism. Not going to be apologetic about our atheism, not going to hesitate, not going to accept you calling us immoral or any of that sort of thing. There are plenty of assertive atheists in the Freedom from Religion Foundation. I know Dan Barker and Annie Laurie Gaylor pretty well, and they're both wonderful people, and they're as assertive atheists as you could ask for. So I'm not talking about every person, but the organization's shtick is as the most militant, assertive, some would say aggressive atheist. Yeah. And, Madeleine Murray O'Hair was famous. She styled herself the most hated woman in America and was very proud of that. I don't know whether that was true or not. She was certainly hated by my family, outrageously and unreasonably, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, I know we're out of time, but I feel like I could ask you about another 30 questions just off the top of my head, and probably a lot more if I thought about it. But I just wanted to wrap up here with a summary. Again, Dr. Ed Buckner and his son, Michael Buckner, wrote the book In Freedom We Trust, An Atheist's Guide to Religious Liberty. I'd love to dive into that with you in a future conversation. And again, very active with different groups such as American Atheists and the Council for Secular Humanism. And obviously making a difference in a lot of areas. And I just wanted to end too with, you're also working with the Atlanta Freethought Society, and you were very, very gracious and welcoming when I came with my children, and just a loving group, a loving spirit, and let me borrow a book from the library. Let me chat with everybody.
Yeah, where's our book?
It's still there. COVID has kept me from coming back, but I've still got it. It'll be back on your shelf soon. But
well,
It's a good
not
one.
Parker, and that's an excellent book. God, the most unpleasant character in literature, or something like that.
Yeah.
Dan is such a good guy. He's real. I'm a life member of FFRF too, and proud to be one. I have been for many years.
Yeah. The book will be back on your shelf as soon as we can get out there with after COVID. But
now, I mean, my wife and I visit the building, which is only half a mile from us. We visit it every once in a while, but we're not holding live meetings there, and don't know when we will again. I mean, if the president of the United States can get COVID, then who can't?
yeah.
Surely he wore a mask all the time and was protected at every turn. Yes, surely, yes.
You got to laugh or you'll cry.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for all that you have done over the years, and I appreciate all your insights today and in other forums. And I hope that everything you're doing really helps people to think through these issues. And I look forward to diving deeper into some of these subjects in the future.
You name the time and we'll do it.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Take care, Dave.